The Last Honest Man in Dusty Creek. Wild West Chronicles, Episode 1. Opening hook. She whispered it so quietly that the wind almost swallowed the words entirely. It's my first time, go easy. Rancher Elias Cord stood perfectly still in the dim light of the stable, his broad shoulders tense beneath his worn leather vest, his jaw set like carved stone. He had heard those words before from frightened colts, from young ranch hands who had never broken ground, from boys who had never held a rope in their lives. But he had never heard them from a woman like her. Never from someone who looked at him the way she did, with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to hold every secret the West had ever buried. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like smoke curling off a dying fire. "It'll be over quick," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And then he took the rope from her trembling hands, stepped behind her, and began to teach her how to lasso a post. But even as his arms moved around hers, even as he guided her grip and corrected her stance, Elias Cord knew, with a quiet, terrifying certainty, that nothing about what was happening between them was going to be quick. Nothing about Ren Calloway was ever going to be simple. And by the time the sun set behind the red mesa that evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood orange, he suspected that his carefully ordered life was about to come completely undone. The town of Dusty Creek was the kind of place that people arrived at by accident and left only when they were ready to die. It sat in a shallow valley between two red rock mesas, close enough to the river to draw water, but far enough from civilization that the nearest telegraph office was a 2-day ride east. The main street was a single strip of packed earth flanked by a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a church that doubled as a courthouse, and a handful of wooden buildings that leaned against one another like tired men at the end of a long day. The population hovered somewhere between 300 and whatever number the last fever had left behind. Elias Cord had lived there his entire life, which was 34 years, give or take the months he had spent driving cattle north along the good night-loving trail. He owned the largest working ranch in the valley, the Double C, named for the two creek tributaries that cut through his land like a pair of silver threads. He had built it himself, board by board, fence post by fence post, with the kind of stubborn patience that people in Dusty Creek either admired deeply or found quietly unnerving. He was not married, he had never been married. This was a fact that the widows and mothers and matchmaking aunts of Dusty Creek found personally offensive, and they spent considerable energy discussing it over Sunday dinners and quilting circles. Elias Cord was tall, broad-shouldered, quietly handsome in the way that hard work and open sky tend to produce, all sun-darkened skin and clear, dark eyes, and the kind of easy steadiness that made horses calm and people trust him instinctively. He was not unkind, he was not cold. He was simply, stubbornly, entirely self-contained, like a good barn, solid, purposeful, not given to unnecessary ornamentation. He liked it that way. He had decided, somewhere around the age of 26, that the particular kind of loneliness he carried was simply the cost of the life he had chosen, and that the cost was worth paying. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late September, the stagecoach from Amarillo rolled into Dusty Creek, carrying 3 passengers, a traveling preacher with a bad knee, a drummer selling patent medicines, and Ren Calloway. Elias was not at the stagecoach stop when she arrived. He was at the general store, negotiating the price of winter grain with old Hector Mass, when the door swung open and Deputy Lena Burrows leaned in with the particular expression she wore when something interesting had happened. "You're going to want to come see this," Lena said. Elias did not look up from the grain ledger. "I'm in the middle of something." "She's asking about the Calloway land." That made him look up. The Calloway homestead had been sitting empty for 3 years, ever since old Thomas Calloway had drunk himself to death and left the property to whatever family he had back east that nobody in Dusty Creek had ever met. The land sat on the western edge of the valley, bordering the Double C along a quarter-mile of dry creek bed. It was decent grazing land, the kind that could be made productive with work, though it had been badly neglected. Elias had quietly hoped, had perhaps even half assumed, that it would eventually come to him by default. He set down the ledger, and followed Lena out into the street. She was standing in front of the stagecoach office with a leather traveling bag at her feet and a folded document in her hands, speaking to the stagecoach driver with an expression of calm, determined patience. She was young, mid-20s, perhaps, with dark hair pinned up under a dusty felt hat and the kind of posture that suggested she had grown up being told to stand straight and had eventually internalized the instruction. She was wearing practical traveling clothes, dusty from the road, and she had a rifle case leaning against her leg that she appeared entirely comfortable with. She was not what Elias had expected. He did not know what he had expected precisely. Someone older, perhaps, someone uncertain, someone who would look at the valley and the dry heat and the hard-edged silence of it all and immediately reconsider whatever had brought them here. Wren Calloway did not look like she was reconsidering anything. She looked like she had made a decision and was prepared to defend it against all available opposition. "That's Thomas Calloway's granddaughter," Lena murmured beside him. "Come to claim the property. Says she's got papers from the county recorder in Amarillo." "That's a long way to come," Elias said. "All by herself, too. No husband, no family, just her and that rifle and about 3 years of back taxes that apparently her grandfather's estate has already paid off." Elias was quiet for a moment, watching her. The stagecoach driver was saying something about the condition of the road west of town, and Wren Calloway was listening with a small, focused frown, the frown of someone cataloging information rather than expressing distress. "She's going to need help," Elias said. It came out more reluctantly than he intended. Lena glanced at him sideways, and he did not miss the small smile she was suppressing. "Yes," she said, "she probably is." He told himself, walking across the street toward her, that it was simply the neighborly thing to do. The Calloway property bordered his. It would be practical to know who was settling it. It would be sensible to offer assistance. These were all reasonable, logical, entirely non-complicated motivations for introducing himself to a stranger. He got approximately 3 feet away before she turned and looked at him. Her eyes were an unusual shade, not quite gray, not quite blue, the particular color of the sky during the 20 minutes after sunset when everything goes silver and uncertain. They were direct eyes. Eyes that looked at you and appeared to be assessing something specific rather than simply performing the social ritual of looking. "Elias Cord," he said, because his name seemed like the safest thing to offer. "Double C Ranch. My property borders yours on the east." She held his gaze for a long moment before she extended her hand, which he shook. Her grip was firm and brief and entirely businesslike. "Wren Calloway," she said, "I know who you are. My grandfather mentioned you in his letters." That surprised him. "I wouldn't have thought old Thomas paid much attention to the neighbors. He said you were the most stubborn man in the valley and probably the most honest." She tilted her head slightly. He meant it as a compliment. "Coming from Thomas Calloway," Elias said slowly, "I'll take it as one." Something shifted in her expression then, just briefly, the ghost of something that might have been grief, might have been amusement, might have been both simultaneously, before she gathered it back and replaced it with the calm, purposeful look she had been wearing before. "I understand the property is in poor condition," she said. "I expect to spend most of the winter making it habitable. I'd appreciate knowing who I can rely on in town." "Lena Burrows is the deputy and the most useful person here," Elias said. "Doc Harney is unreliable on Thursdays, but competent the rest of the week. The Mass family at the general store are honest. The Copper Spur serves decent food if you eat before 9. "And you?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it apparently required. "I'm reliable," he said finally. "On the condition that you tell me what you actually need, rather than what you think you should ask for." She studied him for another of those long, assessing moments. Then she gave a single, small nod, the nod of someone who has filed a piece of information in a particular place and intends to return to it later. "Understood," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." The Calloway homestead was exactly as bad as its reputation suggested, and possibly a little worse. Elias rode out with her the following morning, not because she had asked him to, she had not, but because he had told her he was reliable, and he intended to demonstrate this in practical terms. He told himself this was entirely about the neighboring property and had nothing to do with the particular quality of her attention or the way she had said his name. The main house was a two-room wooden structure that had survived 3 winters of abandonment, with the structural integrity of a serious grudge, still standing, but barely and clearly angry about it. The roof had given way in 2 places. The front porch sagged dangerously. The door hung open at a broken angle, and the interior had been colonized by what appeared to be a substantial family of raccoons and some truly ambitious mold. The barn was in marginally better shape. The walls were solid, the loft intact, though the stalls needed complete rebuilding. The fencing was a disaster. The well had been improperly capped and would need to be cleared before it was safe to use. The grazing fields were overgrown with scrub that would take a full season to clear properly. Wren walked through all of it without saying a word for a long time. She walked slowly and carefully, touching walls, testing floorboards, studying angles. She had a small notebook in her breast pocket, and occasionally she stopped and wrote something in it. Elias walked at a respectful distance, offering information when she asked for it and staying quiet when she did not. "The house is salvageable," he said when they had made a full circuit. "The structural posts are sound, the rest is surface damage." "The barn first," she said. "I can sleep in the barn while the house is being worked on." He looked at her. "It's going to get cold. I know how to build a fire. It's going to get very cold." She met his look with equanimity. "Mr. Cord, I traveled 2,000 miles on 3 different trains and a stagecoach to get here. I didn't do that because I was planning to be comfortable." He absorbed this. "Fair enough. I'll need to hire some hands," she said, moving toward the fence line and studying it with her arms crossed. "At least 2, possibly 3. Is there reliable labor in town?" "A few men who will work hard for a fair wage," he said. "I can introduce you. I'd also offer my own crew for the first week. Getting the roof and the well sorted is more important than the fencing, and I've got 2 hands who have done both before." She turned to look at him, and he recognized the expression. It was the same one she had worn on the street in town, the assessing look. "Why?" she asked. The directness of it almost made him smile. "Almost. Because you're a neighbor," he said, "and because leaving a well in that condition is a danger to my cattle too if they wander this way." It was true. It was also not the complete truth, but it was enough truth to be going on with. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the fence line. "I pay for work," she said. "I don't accept charity." "I know," he said. "I didn't offer charity. I offered practical assistance in exchange for understanding my new neighbor's intentions for the property." A beat of silence. Then very quietly, just barely, she smiled. It was a small smile, careful and contained, the kind that seemed like it didn't get deployed very often and was therefore worth more than a broad grin. "That's a reasonable trade," she said. They rode back to town mostly in silence, which suited them both. But as they reached the edge of the Double C, where the track split toward her property and his, she paused her horse and turned to look at him with a different sort of expression, something quieter, something that had dropped the businesslike armor for just a moment. "My grandfather died alone," she said. "On this land, I should have come sooner." Elias did not offer platitudes. He understood instinctively that she was not asking for them. "You're here now," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned her horse west and rode toward the Callaway homestead, and he watched her go until the dust settled and the track was empty. He told himself, riding back to his own land, that he was simply being neighborly. He told himself this several times, with diminishing conviction, on the way home. The work began on a Thursday. 2 of Elias' hands, a quiet, capable man named Tobias Hale and a younger ranch hand called Garrett, arrived at the Callaway homestead at dawn with tools and lumber, accompanied by Elias himself. Wren was already awake, already working, already 3/4 through clearing the debris from the barn floor when they arrived. She had made camp in the corner of the barn nearest to the intact wall, with a bedroll and a small iron stove that she must have brought with her in the stage or acquired from somewhere in town. It was spare and deliberate and entirely functional, like everything about her, and Elias noted without comment that it was also arranged with a kind of careful order that suggested someone who had thought deeply about how to make limited resources serve maximum purpose. She shook hands with Tobias and Garrett with the same direct firmness she had offered him, looked them both in the eye and said, "I want to understand what you're doing and why at each step. If that's going to be a problem, I need to know now." Tobias glanced at Elias, who kept his expression neutral. "No problem," Tobias said, with the philosophical calm of a man who had worked for Elias Cord for 11 years and had developed considerable adaptability. "What do you want to start with?" "The well," she said, "and the roof, simultaneously if we can manage it." They could manage it, and they did. Elias worked the roof with Garrett, while Tobias began clearing the well casing. Wren moved between both tasks with the notebook always in her pocket, asking questions that were precise and intelligent, learning quickly, and doing her share of the physical work without being asked. By noon, she was passing roofing nails with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. Elias found himself watching her more than was strictly necessary for the work. There was something in the way she moved that was different from most people, a quality of attention that was both inward and outward simultaneously, like she was always listening to two things at once, the work in front of her and some interior conversation that ran parallel to everything else. She was not a talker, neither was he, but the silences between them were, from the first day, oddly comfortable, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because it's already doing something useful. "Where did you come from before Amarillo?" he asked during a noon break, when they were sitting on opposite sides of the barn eating the lunch she had prepared, dried beef, cornbread, and an unexpectedly good coffee made on the small camp stove. "Boston," she said, "originally, then St. Louis for 2 years, then Amarillo." "What did you do in Boston?" "School teaching, some bookkeeping." She looked at her coffee. "My family thought I would keep doing that." "What happened?" She was quiet for a moment. "I received my grandfather's letter 3 years ago before he died. He said the land was mine if I wanted it. He said," she paused, "he said it was the only honest thing he had to leave anyone." Elias let that sit for a moment. "And you waited 3 years." "I had obligations to work through," she said, "and I needed to learn some things." "What things?" She looked at him. "Ranching," she said, "fencing, water management, livestock. I spent 1.5 years learning before I came. I didn't want to arrive here helpless." He absorbed this. "You don't seem like someone who would." "I'm not," she said simply, and she picked up her coffee again, and that was the end of that conversation. But it stayed with him through the afternoon. The image of her somewhere in Amarillo or perhaps further east, deliberately and systematically preparing herself for a life she had chosen over the one she'd been assigned. There was something in that he recognized. He had done the same thing himself, in his own way, building the Double C out of nothing because he had decided this was what his life would be, and he was going to make it exactly that way, whatever the cost. He recognized the quality of that decision in her. It was the same quality. A certain kind of willingness to be entirely honest with yourself about what you want and then pay the full price of it. He found that recognition unexpectedly disarming. By the end of the first week, the well was clear and functional, the roof was patched in all critical places, and the structural assessment of the main house had been completed. By the end of the second week, the barn stalls were rebuilt, 2 of the fencing gaps had been closed, and Wren had hired 2 local men, Dario and old Pete Saunders, to continue the work on a permanent basis. She paid them fairly and on time, which was more than some employers in the valley could claim. Word traveled, as it always did in small places, and within the month, the consensus in Dusty Creek was that Thomas Calloway's granddaughter was serious, competent, and not to be underestimated. Elias Cord knew this already. He continued to ride out to the Calloway property every few days, for reasons that became increasingly difficult to categorize as purely practical. He told himself there were legitimate reasons for the visits: a shared fence line to negotiate, questions about water rights from the dry creek bed, discussion about whether the spring grazing lands might be used jointly while the Callaway fencing was completed. These were all real things. They were simply not, if he was being fully honest with himself, which he preferred to be, the primary reason for the visits. The primary reason was that he found her company unexpectedly, almost alarmingly, interesting. She was funny in a dry, oblique way that required attention to catch. She had opinions about everything from fencing angles to reconstruction politics to the correct way to make cornbread, without sugar, emphatically, and she offered them with a directness that some people probably found abrasive and he found entirely refreshing. She could ride well, she had clearly worked at it, and the work showed, though there were still rough edges that spoke of adult learning rather than childhood instinct. She was reading through her grandfather's ledgers and land records with the methodical attention of a scholar, and occasionally she would call him over to a page and ask him to explain some local reference or historical context that he alone could provide. These moments, when they sat side by side over the old ledgers with their heads nearly touching in the dim lamplight, were the moments he was most careful about. He was 43 days into knowing her when the lasso incident happened. She had mentioned, during one of their fence line discussions, that she needed to learn to rope cattle properly, not the clumsy amateur version she had managed to approximate in Amarillo, but the functional, reliable technique she would need when working her own stock. Elias had offered to show her. He had been entirely businesslike about the offer. He had been entirely clear about the practical necessity. And then he had arrived at the Callaway barn at the appointed time, and she had said, in that quiet, entirely unguarded way she sometimes had when she forgot to be careful, "It's my first time, really, go easy." And something had shifted in his chest, quiet and tectonic, like a fault line that had been building pressure for 43 days and had finally, quietly, decided to move. He had given the answer that made sense, the practical answer, the answer about the rope and the post. And he had stepped behind her and guided her hands and shown her the motion, and had been entirely professional about all of it, had noticed absolutely nothing about the way she smelled faintly of wood smoke, and something floral and entirely incongruous with the barn, had paid zero attention to the way she exhaled slowly and leaned very slightly back into his guidance before catching herself and straightening. He had noticed none of these things at all. When she made the throw and caught the post cleanly on the third try, she turned to look at him over her shoulder with unguarded delight, a real smile, broad and sudden, entirely different from the small, careful ones he had seen before, and he looked at it for approximately 1 second longer than was advisable before he said, "Good. Again." She did it again. He stepped back. He found something useful to do with his hands that involved checking the condition of the rope, which did not need checking. "What did you do before you built the double C?" she asked, practicing the throw on her own with the quiet concentration she brought to everything. "Cattle drives," he said, "north along the goodnight-loving trail twice. Before that, worked my father's land until he sold it." "Why did he sell it?" "Couldn't make it profitable. He was a good man, but not a patient one." Elias watched her correct her wrist angle without being told and felt a quiet satisfaction that was probably inappropriate given the context. Patience matters more than almost anything else in this work. She considered this. "What's the second most important thing?" "Honesty," he said, "with other people, but more importantly with yourself. The land doesn't care about the story you tell yourself. It only responds to what you actually do." She stopped throwing and turned to look at him fully with that steady silver-gray gaze. "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me since I arrived," she said. He didn't know what to do with that, so he said, "Try again and bend your elbow more at the release." She bent her elbow and caught the post on the first try. He told himself, on the ride home that evening, that he was managing the situation perfectly well. He was being a good neighbor. He was being reliable, as he had promised. He was providing practical assistance and honest guidance, and there was absolutely no reason for anything to be complicated. His horse, a sensible bay mare who had been with him for 9 years, appeared skeptical. Deputy Lena Burrows was 31 years old and had been the law in Dusty Creek for 6 years, having inherited the position from her father when he retired with bad arthritis, and the town had decided, in its pragmatic way, that competence mattered more than convention. She was observant by profession and by temperament, and she had known Elias Cord for most of her life. She knew, therefore, approximately 3 weeks after Wren Calloway arrived in Dusty Creek, exactly what was happening and approximately how long it would take for Elias Cord to acknowledge it. She estimated a long time, possibly an embarrassingly long time. She kept this assessment to herself, mostly, though she did allow herself to enjoy the evidence as it accumulated. She saw Elias in town more often than his usual supply run schedule required. She noticed he had taken to timing these visits to coincide with mornings when Wren came in to deal with paperwork at the land office. She noted, with professional precision, the particular way his expression shifted when he spotted Wren across the street. Something in his jaw, something in the set of his shoulders, the kind of infinitesimal softening that only someone who knew the default setting would recognize as a change. She noted, equally, the way Wren Calloway tracked Elias across a room with those quiet silver eyes when she thought no one was watching, the way she mentioned him with studied casualness in conversation. Elias said the winter grazing would hold until December. Elias thinks the south fence can wait. Apparently, according to Elias. Lena found this thoroughly entertaining and kept her thoughts to herself, which was the professional thing to do. What was less entertaining and less likely to resolve itself without intervention was what she saw one Thursday evening at the Copper Spur. Elias was there for the practical reason of having dinner and a quiet drink at the end of a long week. Wren was there because Lena had invited her, having determined that Wren needed to know more people in town and that the Copper Spur on a Thursday was the most pleasant social environment Dusty Creek could offer. They were at separate tables initially for approximately 12 minutes before the natural gravitational pull of the situation resulted in them occupying the same table corner, talking about water rights, which Lena was certain was not actually what they were talking about. What Lena had not anticipated was Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 37, handsome in an obvious way, recently arrived from Santa Fe, where he had apparently done something vaguely profitable in land speculation. He had money, charm, and a smile that he used like a tool, and he had clearly arrived at the Copper Spur that evening with his attention already directed at Wren Calloway, who was objectively the most interesting new person in Dusty Creek, and also objectively quite striking. Lena watched Marcus introduce himself to Wren with his best Santa Fe smile, and she watched, simultaneously, Elias Cord's expression perform a series of very small but very clear movements. First, neutral, the polite, contained neutrality of a man who has no particular feeling about what he's seeing. Second, a slight, controlled tension around the eyes that Lena had seen before on men who were feeling something they were not prepared to admit to feeling. Third, the particular quality of stillness that Elias Cord deployed when he was working very hard to appear entirely uninvested in a situation. Lena picked up her drink and watched with the serene patience of someone who had an excellent seat. Wren, for her part, was polite to Marcus Webb and nothing more. She answered his questions with her usual direct economy, showed no particular interest in his Santa Fe stories, and returned, at the first reasonable opportunity, to her conversation with Elias. But Marcus Webb was not discouraged by this. He sat down at their table without being invited, and Elias, who was too fundamentally courteous to object to this in public, absorbed the presence with an expression that Lena privately described in her own mental catalogue as approximately pleasant, actually suffering. What happened next was interesting. Marcus Webb, attempting to impress Wren with his land speculation expertise, made several statements about water rights and property valuation that were factually incorrect in ways that anyone with Wren's preparation would recognize. Wren recognized them. She corrected him, politely but precisely, and Marcus laughed it off with the particular laugh of a man who finds female competence charming only in the abstract and slightly uncomfortable in the concrete. Elias Cord said nothing. He simply sat back slightly, picked up his coffee, and looked at Marcus Webb with a very quiet, very steady expression. He did not say anything unkind. He did not say anything at all for a long moment. And then, when Marcus had finished explaining why Wren's correction was charming but perhaps not quite accurate, Elias said very quietly, "She's right." 2 words, that was all. The absolute minimum required to say the thing that needed to be said, delivered with the flat, unhurried certainty of a man who does not feel the need to raise his voice to be believed. Marcus Webb moved on to other companies shortly after. Lena watched Wren look at Elias after Marcus left, not the businesslike assessing look she usually deployed, but something different, something quieter, something that stayed on his face for a moment longer than she likely intended. And she watched Elias not look back, because he was studying his coffee with the extreme concentration of a man who is doing everything in his considerable power not to notice the way someone is looking at him. Lena set down her drink. Good grief, she thought, this is going to take forever. October came in hard, with a week of cold wind and then a 3-day storm that came down from the north and put 6 inches of wet snow across the valley, which was early for the season and not welcome. Elias rode out to the Callaway property on the 2nd day of the storm, not because she had asked him to, she had not, but because the temperature had dropped sharply overnight and he had spent an unreasonable amount of the previous night thinking about the fact that she was sleeping in a barn with a small iron stove and no real insulation, and the roof had only been partially repaired, and if the wet snow load caused the remaining weak sections to give way. He arrived to find the barn intact, and Wren outside, in the snow, with her 2 hired hands, working to reinforce the east wall of the barn with additional posts she had apparently cut and prepared herself in anticipation of exactly this scenario. He stopped his horse and looked at her for a moment, knee-deep in snow, breath coming in white clouds, hair escaping in dark strands from under her hat, and wearing an expression of calm, focused effort that he was beginning to recognize as her default state when doing something that needed to be done. "I thought you might need," he started. "Grab the other end of this post," she said, without looking up. He got off his horse and grabbed the other end of the post. They worked for 4 hours, through the continuing snow, bracing the weakest sections of the barn wall and clearing the snow load from the partially repaired roof sections before they could collapse. Wren worked steadily and without complaint, coordinating her hired hands with a quiet efficiency that had clearly developed over the 2 months she had been here. She knew her land now, knew which structures were most vulnerable, had already prioritized and prepared. She had not been waiting for anyone to come and save her. She had been handling it. He found this fact, which should have been entirely straightforward, somewhat complicated to sit with. When the most critical work was done, and Dario and Pete had gone in for hot food, they were standing in the barn doorway looking out at the still falling snow, both breathing hard from the work, both covered in the particular combination of snow and mud that hard winter labor produces. The light was going early, turning the valley blue-gray and quiet. "You didn't have to come," she said, not unkindly, just accurately. "I know," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "Why did you?" He thought about the honest answer, which was complicated and probably inadvisable, and then he thought about the practical answer, which was thin, and they both knew it, and then he said, "I was concerned about the partial roof repairs in a wet snow load event." A silence, the snow fell quietly between them. "That's a very practical reason," she said. "It's a true reason," he said. "Is it the only reason?" He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the snow, not at him, which was the only reason this conversation was happening at all. There was something in her profile, the particular quality of the question, the stillness she had gone into while asking it, that suggested this was not idle curiosity. "No," he said. The word fell into the quiet between them and sat there. She nodded very slightly, just once, as if he had confirmed something she had suspected. Then she said, There's coffee inside if you want to stay until the snow eases. It was the most she had ever offered him in the direct sense. He recognized it as such. "Thank you," he said. They sat by the iron stove in the corner of the barn, which she had made as hospitable as a barn could reasonably be made, with two old chairs and a small folding table and a hurricane lamp turned to a warm amber glow. The snow hushed everything outside. Dario and Pete were in the far corner playing cards. The coffee was strong and good. They did not talk about the single exchange that had just happened. They talked about other things, the spring grazing plan, the livestock she intended to acquire, whether the creekbed fence line was practical or whether they would be better served with a different arrangement. Ordinary, practical, necessary conversation. But the ordinary conversation was doing something else at the same time. It was occupying the surface while something else occupied the space underneath, something patient and quiet and entirely present that neither of them named and neither of them moved away from. When the snow eased enough to ride, he stood to go. She walked him to the barn door. In the cold, early dark air of the storm's aftermath, their breath made small white clouds that briefly merged and dispersed. "Thank you for coming," she said, and there was something in her voice, just under the surface of the words, that he had not heard from her before, something that was not businesslike. "Anytime," he said, and then caught himself, because the word had come out different than he intended, not a social courtesy, but something more specific, more weighted, more honest. She heard it, he could tell by the quality of the silence that followed. He got on his horse and rode home through the blue-gray dusk, and he spent the next 3 days being very sensible about the entire situation. Wren Calloway thought, during those same 3 days, very methodically about several things. She thought about what she had come here to do and why. She had come to claim her grandfather's land because it was hers, and because she had needed, deeply, fundamentally needed, to build something that was entirely her own. Not the schoolroom in Boston where she taught other people's children the history of other people's decisions. Not the bookkeeping office in St. Louis where she managed other people's accounts. Something that was hers from the ground up, that she had prepared for and worked for, and that existed because of her choices and her effort. This was not complicated. This was clear. This had been her entire reason for being here. What was complicated was the secondary situation that had developed. Without her full participation or consent over the past 2 months. She thought about Elia's cord with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, and the assessment was not reassuring. She noticed, she could not help but notice, the way he listened. Not the performance of listening, the polite nodding and eye contact that most people offered as a social currency, but actual listening, the kind that absorbed and retained and occasionally returned information in unexpected ways that proved he had been paying more attention than was strictly required. She noticed the particular quality of his silences, which were not awkward or vacant, but full of thought, full of presence, full of that steady, unhurried attentiveness that was the quality she had identified in him first, before anything else. She noticed the way the conversation they had in the barn doorway had happened, and what it had said, and what she had said back, and what had been said without words. She admitted to herself in the private honesty of the pre-dawn hours, extremely careful. She had been building walls at exactly the same rate she had been building fences, deliberately, systematically, for good structural reasons. She had not come all this way to make the same kinds of mistakes she had watched other people make, the mistakes of confusing need for feeling and feeling for reason. She had work to do. She had a life to build. She was not here to be swept up in something. She had been very careful and very sensible. And then there had been the moment in the heavy snow, the moment he had said no, and then it's a true reason, and then no, and she had felt something shift in the architecture of her careful structures that she was quite certain she had not consented to. She thought about this very precisely for 3 days. Then she went back to work, because work was what she had and work was what made sense. And if Elia's cord rode over to check the fence line on Thursday, she would behave exactly as she had been behaving, and everything would be fine. Elia's cord did not ride over on Thursday. He did not ride over on Friday either. By Saturday morning, she was aware of his absence in a way she found genuinely inconvenient. She rode into town for supplies and did not go past the Double C, which she could have done and had no reason to do except the reason she was not acknowledging. She collected her supplies at the Mass General Store and had a brief conversation with Lena Burrows about the state of the town's water arrangements, and she did not ask about Elia's, which took more deliberate effort than she was comfortable with. On the way home, she rode past the turn that led to the Double C. She did not take the turn. She was, she told herself, entirely fine. November arrived with a cold clarity that made the valley look like something carved from glass, and with it came a new silence between Elias and Wren that was entirely different from the easy silences they had developed over the previous months. It was not hostile, it was not indifferent. It was the particular charged silence of two people who have arrived independently and simultaneously at the same understanding and have both decided, for presumably good reasons, to retreat from it. Elias retreated to the Double C and the winter work that always accumulated. He was busy. He was genuinely, legitimately, undeniably busy. There were cattle to move to the winter pastures, fencing to repair before the hardest cold came, a section of the main barn roof that needed the same attention he had given to Wren's barn. He had foremen to manage and accounts to settle and a dozen legitimate demands on his time that had nothing to do with the Callaway property. He was also, and he was honest enough to admit this in his most private self, giving her space. She had come here to build something of her own. She had said that clearly in a dozen different ways and a dozen different conversations. She did not want to be complicated. She did not want her carefully planned independent life to be disrupted by something she had not planned for. He understood this. He respected it. He was going to respect it from a comfortable and entirely sensible distance. Wren, for her part, built an excellent winter fence along the south property line and began laying the foundation for a chicken coop, both of which kept her very productively occupied. She came into town twice a week for supplies and once a week for the standing Thursday dinner at the Copper Spur that had become, through the accumulation of weeks, a kind of informal community gathering that Lena had organized and that most of the town's reasonable people attended. Elias attended the Thursday dinners. So did Wren. They sat near each other because the table arrangements and social gravity made this more or less inevitable, and they talked about the weather and the spring cattle sales and the state of the valley's water table, and they were entirely pleasant and entirely normal, and Lena Burrows sat across the table from them both and drank her coffee with the expression of a woman watching a very slow natural phenomenon and waiting for it to complete. The complications began, as complications often do in small towns, with the arrival of news. The news arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by the eastbound mail rider. Marcus Webb had made an offer to purchase the Callaway homestead, a formal offer in writing through the county land office in Amarillo, citing 3 years of unpaid maintenance obligations that had apparently been legally complicated in ways that Wren's own papers had not fully resolved. The offer was low, insulting, actually, but it was legally sophisticated in ways that suggested Webb had done research and perhaps received advice. Wren came to town with the papers on Thursday morning, her expression contained in the particular way that meant she was dealing with something serious and was not going to show how serious she found it. She went to the land office first, and then to Lena's office, and then Lena came to find Elias at the general store. She needs a lawyer, Lena said, or someone who knows the water rights history on that land. The legal argument hinges on the historical creekbed claim, and you're the only person who knows that history well enough to document it. Elias set down what he was doing. He found her at the land office, sitting across from the clerk with the papers spread in front of her, her back perfectly straight, and her expression entirely composed in the way that he had come to recognize specifically as the way she looked when she was the most concerned. Not when things were easy. When things were easy, she was relaxed. She moved freely. She let the occasional smile through. The rigid composure was the armor she put on when something was threatening something she cared about. She looked up when he came in. Something moved across her expression, complicated, quick, before the composure settled back into place. "You didn't have to come," she said, again. "I know," he said, again. He sat down across from her and pulled the papers toward him and read through them carefully. The clerk, recognizing that something important was happening, found an urgent need to be elsewhere in the building. The legal argument was what Lena had said. It hinged on the historical claim to the dry creek bed that divided the Callaway and Double C properties, and on a maintenance obligation that the land records were ambiguous about. Elias read through it twice and then he said, "This is wrong." "I know it's wrong," she said. "I mean it's legally wrong. The creek bed claim was settled in 1869 when my father and Thomas Callaway filed a joint survey with the county recorder. I have a copy of that survey. It establishes the maintenance boundary clearly. Webb's lawyers either didn't find it or chose not to mention it." She looked at him. "You have a copy?" "My father was meticulous about records. I have everything he ever filed." A long moment. "Elias, I'll ride back and get it now. You can have it filed before the close of business tomorrow." Elias, her voice was different now, and he looked at her, really looked at her, not the careful glancing looks he had been managing for the past 2 weeks. She was looking at him with the armor entirely down, just for a moment, the composed professionalism entirely set aside. "Thank you," she said, and she said it the way she had said thank you in the barn doorway, in the snowstorm, the way that meant something specific and important, and more than the words themselves. "Thank you," he said back, very quietly, because it was the right response, and also because it meant something specific he wasn't able to say directly. He rode back to the Double C and retrieved the 1869 survey document. His father's careful handwriting on the boundary lines, the joint signatures. The county recorder's stamp, and brought it back to town before noon. He sat with Wren and the land office clerk for 2 hours while the counter-documentation was assembled and filed. He did not have to do this. Wren could have navigated it herself once she had the document. He stayed because the possibility of her not winning this was something he found entirely unacceptable, and because sitting next to her over the land records, their heads together over the careful old survey map, felt both necessary and something else that he was still not addressing directly. The counterfiling went through. Webb's offer was legally dismissed within 10 days. The Callaway property was incontestably Wren's. She did not come to the Thursday dinner that week. He did not ride over to check on her. Marcus Webb did not, as Elias had perhaps hoped, take his dismissed legal maneuver as a sign to redirect his interests elsewhere. He was in Dusty Creek because he had found a property he wanted, and the property question had merely shifted. He appeared at the Thursday dinner the following week with his Santa Fe smile fully operational and his attention clearly refocused on Wren, who received him with the same polite distance she had offered before and which he interpreted, apparently, as encouragement. Elias sat at the far end of the table and was extremely focused on his meal. He told himself that he had no standing to feel anything about this. Wren Callaway was an independent woman who had come to this valley to build a life of her own choosing. She was not his. She had not offered herself to be anyone's in any way he could point to clearly. She was not asking for his protection from Santa Fe land speculators who had too much confidence and not enough self-awareness. She could manage this herself, as she managed everything herself. She did not need him. He was perfectly fine with all of this. He was so perfectly fine with all of this that he had 3 cups of coffee instead of 2, and replied to whatever Tobias said to him with a beat's delay more than once, which Tobias noted privately and said nothing about. What happened next was not his doing. It was not engineered or planned or anything other than what it appeared to be, which was Wren Callaway reaching the limit of her considerable patience. Marcus Webb, in the course of explaining his land investment philosophy to the table at large, made a comment about the Callaway property that was not inaccurate, but was framed in a way that treated it as a speculative asset rather than a home, as a piece of business rather than a life. Wren let the first version of this pass. She let the second pass also. On the third, she set down her coffee and looked at Marcus Webb with an expression that Elias recognized immediately as the one she wore when she had decided that politeness had reached its practical limit. "The Calloway property," she said, with a quietness that was its own kind of emphasis, "is not and will not be for sale, not in any form, to any party, for any sum. I want to make certain that's understood." Marcus Webb started to say something about the realities of Western land investment. "Clearly," Wren said. The word was very small and very precise, and it carried enough finality that the conversation ended. The table moved on to other subjects, but Elias, across the table, found himself looking at her again, at the straight line of her spine. The contained composure now settled back into place, the small, careful way she picked up her coffee and resumed exactly as if nothing had happened, and he felt something come to a point inside him that had been accumulating quietly for 11 weeks. He knew the feeling. He had felt it before, though not for a long time and not like this, not with this particular quality, this specific weight. He had spent a long time being content with the particular loneliness he had decided was the cost of his particular life. He had been very committed to that choice. He had built a whole life around the architecture of that choice. He had not planned for Wren Calloway. He had not planned for the version of himself that existed around her, the one who listened differently, who thought about things differently, who had an opinion about 1869 survey documents and wet snow roof loads that had nothing to do with his own property. He had not planned for the fact that the most interesting place he had found to be, in 11 weeks, was wherever she happened to be. He also had not figured out what to do about this, or whether doing anything about it was appropriate or wise or what she would want. So he continued to eat his dinner and be extremely fine with everything. Lena Burrows intervened on a Friday in mid-November with the professional decisiveness of someone who has identified a problem and has both the means and the mandate to address it. She did not intervene in the way people in novels intervene, with theatrical confrontations or heavy-handed maneuvering. She intervened in the Lena Burrows way, which was to invite both Elias and Wren to help her with something legitimate and practical, specifically the restaking of the county boundary markers along the valley's western edge, which genuinely needed to be done before the winter hardened the ground further and which required at least 3 people for accuracy. They met at the western boundary at 8 in the morning. They did the work, which took approximately 4 hours and involved a lot of measuring and some difficult digging, and a discussion about the placement of the southwest marker that required all 3 of them. When the work was done, Lena announced that she had a town matter to attend to and rode back without them, leaving them at the boundary marker with their horses and the valley spread out below in the cold, clear November light. This was the intervention, not conversation, not confrontation, just space and time and the most beautiful view in the valley. Elias understood what Lena had done approximately 30 seconds after she disappeared around the rock formation, and he was briefly, quietly annoyed by it, and then he was grateful, and then he was just standing there next to Wren Calloway, looking out over the valley and the red mesas and the silver thread of the main creek and the pale blue November sky. "She did that on purpose," Wren said. "Yes," he said. A silence. The wind moved through the dry grass below the marker. Somewhere far away, a hawk called. "She's not subtle," Wren said. "She's perfectly subtle," he said. "This took real planning." Wren made a small sound that was almost a laugh. She was looking out at the valley, and he was watching the side of her face, which he had long since stopped pretending not to do when she wasn't looking at him. The cold air had brought color into her cheeks. She had her hat pulled low and her coat buttoned to the collar, and she looked like she had grown up here, like the land had been waiting for her specific shape to fill the particular space she occupied. "I owe you more than I've said," she began. "You don't owe me anything. The survey document. That was neighborly. The storm. That was practical." "Elias," she turned to look at him, and he looked back, and they did not look away. "I'm trying to say something." "I know," he said. "I came here to build something alone," she said. "I was very clear about that. In my head, for a very long time, I was clear." "I know," he said again. "I wasn't planning for anything to be complicated," she said. I know. Will you stop saying that? Probably not, he said, and then, very carefully, I wasn't planning for anything complicated either. She looked at him, he looked at her. The valley lay spread below them, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to whatever they decided. I don't know what I'm doing, she said, with a frankness that was so entirely her that he felt it somewhere deep and specific. I've spent my whole life being very clear about what I'm doing, and now she stopped, looked away. I don't know what this is. I think you do, he said quietly. I think we both do. Another silence, longer. She had her arms crossed against the cold, and he was standing close enough that he could see the small details of her expression, the line between her brows, the slight movement at the corner of her mouth that was either working towards something or away from it. I'm afraid of it, she said. The words came out like they cost something significant. I know, he said for the fourth time, and then caught himself and said instead, so am I. She looked at him again, and something shifted in her expression, something that opened rather than closed, something that moved toward rather than away. You are. I built my whole life around not being complicated, he said. I made very specific choices about what I was willing to risk. And then you arrived on the stagecoach and asked about your grandfather's land and looked at me like you were filing information for later use, and he stopped, found the words, which were not difficult to find if you were committed to honesty, and I've been thinking about what to do about that ever since. The wind moved between them. Below, the valley held its enormous quiet. What do you think we should do about it? She asked. I think, he said slowly, that we are two people who are both very committed to being honest and both very capable of doing difficult things, and I think that probably the most practical course of action is to stop pretending that this is not what it is. She studied him for a long moment. He waited, because he had learned that she needed space to process things at her own rate, and that patience, in all things, was what he had said it was more important than almost anything else. What is it? She asked. I think you know what it is, he said. I think we both do. The small smile appeared, the real one, not the careful one, brief and bright and entirely unguarded. You can be very infuriating, she said. I know. She looked away at the valley, and then back at him, and something in her expression had changed in the way that things change when a decision gets made, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the quiet finality of something that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived. All right, she said. All right, he said. They stood there for another moment, the wind and the hawk and the enormous valley all present and patient around them. And then she turned and walked toward her horse, and he walked toward his, and they rode back toward Dusty Creek side by side in the clear cold light, not talking very much, not needing to. What changed was not everything at once. It was not a sudden transformation or a dramatic scene. It was gradual in the way that genuine things tend to be gradual. He came to the Callaway property on Saturdays, not for the fence line or the water rights, not for any practical reason at all, simply because she was there, and that was now an acceptable reason. She rode over to the Double C on Sunday mornings, and they had coffee and worked through the week's accounts together, which was a practical arrangement and also something else entirely. During the Thursday dinners, they sat together without the studied casualness of before, just together, simply, naturally, without either of them performing indifference. These were small things, ordinary things. They were also, in the particular economy of two people who had both been alone for a long time and had built whole philosophies around that aloneness, significant things. The first time he reached over, during a Sunday morning coffee, and put his hand over hers on the table without any particular reason, not because she had said something difficult, not because there was a point to make, just because she was there and the impulse was honest. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned her hand over so their palms were touching, and she looked back at the ledger they had been working on, and he looked back at the ledger, and they both pretended very casually that this was entirely ordinary, which it was, and also absolutely was not. Lena thinks she's responsible for this, Ren said, some time after, without looking up. She is partially, Elias said. Only partially. He thought about it, the storm helped, and the rope lesson. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were bright in a way he was still learning to read, something between amusement and something warmer, something that was becoming familiar in the particular way that things become familiar when you stop keeping them at arm's length. The rope lesson, she said. The rope lesson, he confirmed. His expression was neutral but not entirely convincing. She laughed, a real laugh, one of the ones that came without preparation and sounded like it surprised her slightly. And then she looked back at the ledger, and he looked back at the ledger, and his hand stayed where it was, and hers stayed where it was, and the Sunday morning continued exactly as it should. Winter settled over the valley in December, with the slow, serious weight of something that intended to stay. The Callaway homestead, which had been a ruin in September, was transformed. The house was now functional, new roof, repaired walls, a working stove, the small interior laid out with Wren's characteristic ordered efficiency. The barn was solid, the well reliable, the south fence complete. She had acquired a small flock of chickens, 4 cattle, and a horse she had named, with dry humor, Reasonable, which she claimed was the quality she intended to cultivate. Reasonable was a difficult mare with strong opinions, and Wren had spent considerable time developing a relationship with her that Elias would have described, if asked, as 2 extremely determined personalities negotiating a mutual arrangement. He watched her work with the mare one cold December morning from the fence line of the adjoining field, not because he had been asked to watch, but because the fence line needed checking and the view was interesting. She had Reasonable on a long line, working her in slow circles, talking to her quietly in the way that good horse people talk, not the words, which didn't matter to the horse, but the steadiness of the voice, the rhythm of it, the quality of calm attention that transmitted through the line and eventually through the horse's body. After a while, she brought Reasonable to a stop and looked over at him. "You've been watching for 20 minutes, she said. "Fence inspection takes time," he said. "There's nothing wrong with that fence. It might be developing a problem on the far post." She brought Reasonable in and looped the line over the fence post with practiced ease. She came over to where he was standing, ducked between the fence rails, and stood beside him with her arms on the top rail, looking at the horse. "She's improving," Elias said, genuinely. "She's stubborn," Wren said, "but honest. When she's unhappy openly. When she's comfortable, you can see it." "Good qualities," he said. "I think so." He looked at the side of her face, at the clear winter light on her skin, and the quiet attentiveness in her expression as she watched her difficult horse. Something in him had been doing this, for weeks now, accumulating small moments, storing them against some future need, the way the land stored water against the dry months. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, without turning. "You," he said, because it was true, and he had stopped finding reasons not to say true things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him with the silver-gray eyes that had, from the first day, seemed to be assessing something specific. He met her gaze steadily. The December cold was sharp and clean between them. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his coat, a small, quiet gesture, precise and deliberate, with the same quality she brought to everything she did. Her fingers were cold against his jaw when they brushed past it, just briefly, and she looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that was entirely open, entirely honest, entirely hers. "Come in for coffee," she said. "Yes," he said. They went in for coffee, and they stayed there through the afternoon, talking about spring plans and the cattle markets and the particular merits of various fence materials, and also, eventually, about her childhood in Boston and the specific texture of the loneliness she had carried there, and about his years alone on the Double C and what he had made of that silence and whether he had always meant to make it permanent. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped being careful, when the walls have been maintained long enough that both parties have recognized they are more trouble than they are worth. The lamp made its small, warm circle against the cold outside. The stove ticked. Reasonable stood in the barn and was occasionally audible being opinionated about something. It was, Elias thought, the best afternoon he could remember in a very long time. The town of Dusty Creek held a Christmas gathering in the church, which it did every year with the resigned practicality of a community that had few alternatives for midwinter socialization. It was not elaborate, a communal meal, some singing, some speeches of variable quality, and a great deal of coffee. But it was warm and it was attended by nearly everyone, and it had the quality, in small places, of annual rituals that accumulate significance simply through repetition. Wren came with Lena, who had appointed herself as Wren's primary social integrator and had done so with her characteristic efficiency. Elias came alone, as he always did. Though this year Tobias caught him checking the door approximately 3 times before the event began, which Tobias noted and said nothing about. She was wearing something that was not her work clothes, something in deep green that he had not seen before, her hair arranged differently, and she looked different in the lamplight of the church than she did in the cold outdoor light of the property, softer and more fully present in a way he could not articulate except to feel it. She found him across the room within approximately 2 minutes of arriving, which he noted, and she would have denied noticing. They occupied the same section of the church for the communal singing. He did not sing well, he never had. She sang quietly, slightly under her breath, which he discovered because he was standing close enough to hear it. Her voice was lower than he expected, and she knew the words to more hymns than he did, which she claimed later was a function of Boston's school teaching and not actual religious conviction. The meal was the usual communal affair, long tables, familiar neighbors, the particular warmth of winter celebrations that exist because human beings need them. Marcus Webb was there, looking polished and slightly out of place, and he spoke to Wren once briefly, and she responded with the same polite economy she always deployed with him, and Elias noted with some private relief that Wren appeared to have reached a decision about Marcus Webb that was clear and final. Later, after the meal, when people were beginning to move toward coats and horses and the cold ride home, Elias found himself and Wren standing in the church doorway at the same moment, a natural convergence of coat retrieving and departure that placed them in the small space of the threshold together, with the cold night outside and the warm lamplight behind. She turned to say something practical probably, about the ride back, and found him already looking at her. The something practical did not get said. The lamplight was amber and warm at her back, and the night beyond was full of stars, the hard, bright winter stars of the high desert that appeared to hang impossibly close to the earth. "It's been a good year," she said, which was not what she had started to say but was true. "It's been a good year," he agreed. A silence, small and warm and full of something. "I wasn't expecting it to be," she said quietly. "When I came here, I was expecting the land and the work. That was what I was expecting. And now," she looked at him steadily, "and now I have the land and the work and," she stopped, "something I wasn't expecting." He was very still. "What weren't you expecting?" She held his gaze with the directness that was so entirely hers, no deflection, no armor, no careful distance. "You," she said, simply, clearly, the same way he had said it to her at the fence line in December. The night was very quiet outside. The stars were enormous and close. Behind them, the church was warm with voices and lamplight and the sound of people who would talk about this moment in the way small towns talk about moments for years. He reached out slowly and took her hand. She looked down at it and then back up at him, and the something in her expression that had been careful and guarded and held at a respectful distance was in this moment entirely open. "Wren," he said. "Yes," she said. And he looked at her for a long moment in the warm light of the doorway, with the cold stars overhead and the valley beyond and everything he had built and everything she was building and the particular fact that 2 people who had both made very careful decisions about being alone had arrived, through a series of fence lines and snowstorms and rope lessons and 1869 survey documents, at the same threshold at the same time. He leaned toward her, slowly and carefully, and she leaned toward him slowly and carefully, and the lamplight was warm, and the night was cold, and the stars were very bright, and the world faded softly to the warm amber of the church doorway, and what happened next was theirs and private and entirely sufficient. After they stood in the doorway for a while longer, not talking, watching the cold stars. Lena is going to be insufferable, Ren said. She's already going to be insufferable, Elias said. It won't change because of this. That's true, a pause, she's earned it. She has, he agreed. Later they rode back through the valley in the Christmas Eve dark, the stars enormous and the horses' breath making white clouds, and at the fork, where the track divided toward their respective properties, they stopped. Same time Thursday, Ren said, which was what they always said. But the way she said it was different, lighter, more comfortable, like something had been unlocked, and the words moved more freely in the space that remained. Same time Thursday, he said. She looked at him one more time in the starlight, and then she smiled, the real smile, the broad one, the one that he had been collecting and returning to since the first time it had appeared in the barn over a clean lasso throw, and she turned her horse toward her property and rode home. He stayed at the fork for a moment, watching her go, the way he had watched her on the first day. But this time the track was not empty when the dust settled. This time there was a light at the Calloway homestead in the distance, small and warm and entirely present. He turned his horse toward the Double C and rode home through the stars. Spring came to the valley in early March, tentative and cold at first, and then, with the sudden warm conviction of something that has been waiting patiently for its turn. The Calloway property in spring was different from the ruin Ren had arrived to in September. The south fence was complete. The chicken coop was functional and populated by opinionated chickens. The house was properly repaired, warm, furnished with the particular combination of practicality and quiet aesthetic sensibility that characterized everything Ren did. The cattle were few but healthy. Reasonable was still difficult, but had developed, with considerable investment of time and patience, a relationship with her person that functioned. Ren had done this, mostly alone, with help where she had chosen to accept it, through a valley winter that had been cold and hard and entirely sufficient. She had built the thing she had come to build. She stood at the edge of the spring pasture on a March morning and looked at what she had made and felt, with a quiet intensity that surprised her even now, the satisfaction of it. She was not alone. This was not the compromise she had feared it might be. She had thought, in the darkest and most honest hours of last autumn, that accepting anything from anyone would mean losing the thing she had come here to claim, the clean, clear independence of a life that was entirely her own making. She had been afraid of the complication. She had been afraid that needing someone meant losing herself. She had been wrong about that, or not wrong exactly, but working with incomplete information, which was a different thing. What she had found was that there was a difference between needing someone to be whole, which was a different kind of need, the kind that hollowed you out, and choosing someone to share the wholeness you had already made. The Calloway property was hers. The work was hers. The decisions were hers. The cold mornings and the difficult fence lines and the negotiation with reasonable and the satisfaction of the sound roof and the cleared well, all of this was hers. What she had not anticipated was that these things could be hers and shared at the same time, that the sharing did not diminish, but expanded. She was still learning this. She suspected she would be learning it for a long time. The south pasture's ready for cattle, Elias said, coming up beside her at the fence line. He had ridden over from the Double C at what she had come to recognize as the exact time he always rode over on Thursday mornings, which was to say immediately after his own morning work was done, and not a moment before and not a moment after, because Elias Cord did not vary his commitments for anything. I know, she said, I'm going to ride to Hector's next week. He's got a small herd he's willing to sell at a reasonable price. Good stock, he agreed, fair man. I'll want your opinion on the price. I'll come with you. She glanced at him sideways. I can negotiate my own cattle purchase. I know, he said. I want to see how you do it. She looked at him for a moment. The spring light was warm and clear, catching the lines at the corners of his eyes, the easy steadiness of his expression. He was not managing her. He was not offering help she had not requested for reasons she had not consented to. He was, and this was the thing she had been learning. Slowly and with considerable resistance, simply interested. In her, in the particular way she moved through the world, in what she was building and how she was building it. "You can come," she said, "but I'm leading the negotiation." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She turned back to the pasture, and he stood beside her, and the spring morning was warm and wide, and full of the particular quality of possibility that belongs only to beginnings that have been properly prepared for. That evening, as the sun went down behind the western mesa and turned the valley amber and rose, they sat on the porch of the Calloway house. The porch she had rebuilt herself, with good solid boards and a straight railing, which had taken her 2 weeks, and about 4 times the lumber she had initially estimated. Elias had brought supper from the Double C, which had become a Thursday habit. She cooked the following week, a trading arrangement they had arrived at without discussion in the natural way that practical people arrive at practical arrangements. The food was simple and good, and they ate in the comfortable quiet that had long since replaced the careful silences of the early months. The sky went through its colors, amber to rose to deep violet to the first pale stars. "Do you remember," Wren said, "what you said about the land?" "I say many things about the land," he said. "That first week, that the land doesn't care about the story you tell yourself, it only responds to what you actually do." "I remember." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening valley. "I think that's true about most things," she said. He waited. "I spent a long time telling myself a particular story," she said, "about what I needed and didn't need, about what kind of life was possible and what wasn't. And I came here because I'd finally decided to do something instead of just narrating." She looked at him, and then the land surprised me. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention she had, over the months, come to understand was his most honest mode, fully present, nothing held back, nothing performed. "The land," he said carefully, "or something on the land." She smiled. "The land," she said. "Specifically, a very stubborn neighbor with a 1869 survey document and strong opinions about roof repairs." "Those opinions were correct," he said. "They were," she agreed, infuriatingly. He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand in the growing dark, and she turned her hand over in the way that had become entirely natural, and they sat there as the last light left the sky and the stars came in, the enormous desert stars that seemed to hang at exactly the right distance above a valley that had been here long before either of them and would be here long after. "Elias," she said. "Yes, I'm glad I came here." "I know," he said, "so am I." The night settled fully around them, warm and still, full of the sound of the spring valley, the creek in the distance, the horses in the barn, the chickens settling to their roost with their particular officious commentary. Reasonable whinnied once, firmly, and was quiet. "She's still impossible," Wren said. "She's honest," he said. "You said those were good qualities." "In a horse," she said. "In a person," she paused. "In a neighbor." "Yes," he said, very quietly. "Yes," she agreed. The stars were very bright and very close, and the valley was entirely, perfectly quiet, and on the porch of the homestead that had been built and rebuilt from a ruin, 2 people who had each made very careful decisions about being alone sat together in the dark, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them needed to. Epilogue. Dusty Creek, the following September. Lena Burrows was, as predicted, insufferable about the entire thing. She brought it up at the Thursday dinners with relentless good humor and a proprietary satisfaction that was, admittedly, partially justified. She told the story of the boundary marker survey to anyone who would listen, embellishing it annually until it had acquired the quality of local legend. She accepted Wren's dry, fond exasperation with the same equanimity she brought to everything. The Callaway property in its second September was a functioning ranch, small but real, with the cattle purchased from Hector, the negotiation conducted by Wren efficiently, while Elias watched with transparent admiration. The fencing complete, the house properly a home. The spring had been good. The summer had been hard, because summers in the valley were always hard, but productive in the way that hard summers can be when the preparation is right. The Double C and the Callaway Ranch shared a fence line along the dry creek bed, and the 1869 survey document was framed and hung in the Callaway kitchen, which Wren claimed was for practical legal reference and Elias claimed was because she had developed an irrational attachment to an old piece of paper, and they disagreed about this weakly, affectionately, without resolution. Reasonable was still difficult. The chickens were opinionated, the well was reliable, the roof held. And on a September evening very like the one a year before, Elias Cord rode to the Callaway property and tied his horse at the porch rail and sat in the second chair that now lived on the porch as a permanent arrangement. And Wren came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the first chair. And the valley lay below them in the amber light of the setting sun, exactly as it had always laid, patient and enormous and entirely itself. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. They sat with the coffee and the light and the sound of the valley in early autumn, the dry grass, the creek, the horses, simple and sufficient. "I have something to ask you," he said after a while. She looked at him. The silver-gray eyes were steady and warm and entirely attentive. "I'm listening," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, at everything she was, at the ranch she had built from a ruin, at the life she had made because she had decided to make it, at the woman who looked at the world with such clear, honest eyes and had looked at him, eventually, with those same eyes. And he said what he had been carrying for a long time and was now, finally, prepared to set down in front of her and let her examine with the directness she brought to everything. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. The valley held its breath. Then she reached out and took his coffee cup out of his hand and set it on the porch rail, and took both his hands in both of hers, and looked at him with the broad, real, entirely unguarded smile, the one he had been collecting since the first time it appeared over a clean lasso throw, and she said, "Yes." The coffee went cold, the stars came in, the valley was quiet. And in the morning, as always, there was work to do. Bell final called to action. And that, my friends, is where their story truly begins. They had arrived as strangers, a rancher who had decided to be alone, and a woman who had decided to need no one, and they had become, through the slow alchemy of honest work and shared winters and 1,000 small moments of showing up when it mattered, something neither of them had planned for. Something better. If this story moved you, if you felt even a fraction of what Elias felt when she said yes, or what Wren felt standing in that barn in the snow knowing he had come not because she asked, but because he couldn't stay away, then this story did what it was meant to do. Read like this video, it tells us this kind of story deserves to continue. Bell subscribe because part 2 is already waiting, and what happens next is going to surprise you. Speech Balloon, leave a comment and tell us, were you Team Wren from the beginning, or did Elias win you over slowly the way he won her over? Because part 2 holds a question that neither of them can answer alone. When Marcus Webb returns, not with legal papers this time, but with something far more dangerous, and Dusty Creek is forced to choose sides, will the thing Elias and Wren built be strong enough to hold? Should I tell you what happens next?